It is a wonderful honor to welcome journalist Jonathan Harounoff to this show. He is a British journalist based in New York, and he reports on Iran, Israel, and Middle Eastern affairs. Jonathan, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Jim.
Yes. I got in touch with you because big news coming from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Its president recently died in an accident. So, what were your first thoughts upon hearing of this?
Well, first, thanks again for having me on. I think what was most interesting was even before we got confirmation that President Raisi and his entourage had died in the helicopter crash, while we were still figuring out the news, and we saw very different reactions coming out from Iranians inside Iran and also abroad in the diaspora. We saw some on the other hand, some on one hand celebrating jubilantly, posting funny memes, hoping that the bears and the wolves in the mountains would get them if the crash doesn't. And on the other hand, we saw the state-run television channels, being much more, not communicating about what's going on, being a bit more somber, a bit more serious, being very communicative, which is not very characteristic of the Islamic Republic. And then once we got confirmation that, in fact, Raisi and his foreign minister had died, we saw more celebrations. We saw fireworks on social media, people dancing, and then we saw from the state-run side, messages about there being 5 days of mourning, and then showing streets packed with people dressed in black. So there were almost two different Irans being presented to us. And I suspect the truth, as it usually is the case, lies somewhere in the middle, in that, President Raisi was not a very popular figure among Iranian people, and he also wasn't particularly charismatic, and he wasn't also particularly influential either. Ultimate power rests with the supreme leader, but this did shake up the Islamic Republic and the clerical establishment, because this was an unexpected event to happen, and he was seen as a potential successor to the supreme leader position once Ali Khamenei passes away. So, whether or not this is going to completely transform the Islamic Republic, the odds are it's probably not going to, but it was definitely an unexpected event and set off a chain of processes that are going to have to happen over the next couple of weeks in order to ensure that the Islamic Republic can continue to function as usual without much disruption.
Right. So this might be a very basic question, but from the outsider looking in as a non-Iranian, I always thought that the spiritual slash temporal power lies in the Ayatollah. In this case, is Ali Khamenei. So what does the president of Iran do?
Well, it's not a basic question, actually.
Okay.
It's you know, when you're thinking of a president, let's say the president of the United States or France, you would just you would assume that they have an awful lot of power. They have a say in the way the country is run on a day-to-day basis, political leanings. I would sort of, not equating the two countries in any stretch of the imagination, but I would equate the president of Iran more like the sort of role of the president of Israel, in that it's more of a sort of a symbolic figure, somebody who attends different events, inaugurating different events. It's an important position, but in terms of the actual day-to-day running of the show, doesn't have a tremendous amount of impact. There's a lot of importance to the role, but in terms of the actual day-to-day running, I wouldn't say it's tremendously impactful, which is probably why you could argue that President Raisi and the foreign minister were in a helicopter together in the first place. Had the president been such an important pivotal figure in the Islamic Republic, it's unlikely that he would have been traveling together in 40-year-old helicopter with another very important figure. So I would say in Iran, President Raisi didn't have a particularly impactful tenure. His tenure when he was elected in 2021 in an election that had one of the lowest participation rates in the Islamic Republic's history. His tenure was very much marked by a clamping down of rights on women, and and then that's what set off the Masa Amini protests. But in terms of like actual policies that you can ascribe to him, it's not that easy to do.
Yes. Of course, President Raisi has been nicknamed the Butcher of Tehran, and I'm sure it's not does not carry a positive connotation at all. So I wonder, is this nickname attributed to him by Iranians or non-Iranians?
I think it was coined probably in the West somewhere, but it has definitely been appropriated and used by Iranians. And the reason why he's called the Butcher of Tehran is because he worked his way up the Islamic Republic system through the judiciary branch of government. He worked his way up the ranks, held very high positions, legal positions, and he sat on the what was known as the Death Commission, death panel that sent thousands and thousands of Iranian political prisoners to the gallows in 1988, around the time of the Iran-Iraq War, and that's why he was given that nickname. And I think that nickname resurfaced around the time of the Masa Amini protest, because he had essentially been one of the, the figureheads in charge of this clamping down on the rights of women and minorities and men, and also sending a lot of them to executing them, killing them on the streets. So that's why that nickname of his resurfaced, and it stuck because he has a lot of blood on his hands, according to a lot of Iranians and non-Iranians.
One more question about the presidency before we move to Israel. So who's going to succeed him as president now, and is there any change in the horizon that you can see?
So elections are taking place the end of June, and people who want to run for government have, I believe, the next couple of days until very early in June to throw their hat into the ring. After that, they have a couple of weeks to campaign, and then there's the election. I don't suspect that there's going to be any reformist figures or more moderate conservatives who are even going to, get into the process of being able to run. It's not a fair democratic system, many would argue, and there's a vetting process that prospective candidates have to go to. They have to go through the Guardian Council, and that Guardian Council ensures that anyone who throws their hat into the ring, shows sufficient, ample loyalty to the regime and the supreme leader, and therefore anyone with ambitions that don't correspond to what the supreme leader wants to do in terms of his conservative vision for the Islamic Republic, they're not going to make it to the ballots. So I don't expect there to be huge change. And I suspect whoever replaces Raisi is also going to be as much of a yes man as Raisi was, and as much of a loyal servant to the supreme leader.
Yes. I suppose speaking of the supreme leader, Khamenei is getting up there. I think he's 85 as of this recording. And so once he passes away, does he have any succession plan in place?
Well, sure he does. Raisi was seen by many as one of a handful of successors who could potentially take over once and become the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. There have been for decades rumors that Khamenei is ill and is in the decline, is in the twilight years of his life. We still haven't, he's still very much in charge, calling the shots. I suspect that when he does pass away, because you rightly said he's 85 and he's not going to be around forever, I think that is going to be the most vulnerable that the Islamic Republic will have been in its 45-year history. And if there's ever going, if the Iranian people who are already discontent and upset after decades of social and economic issues, that will be the time where they would likely rise up. We'll see, I'm sure, in the coming weeks, or coming months, discussions over who might emerge as and other potential successors. There were also talks around the Supreme Leader's son, Moshtaba, also being in the running. He runs the Supreme Leader's office. He's like in his innermost circle. Raisi was also in his innermost circle. But I'm sure in the coming months we'll see other potential figures emerge as front runners.
Yes. I find it very interesting that this regime, which represents perhaps the worst of Islamic conservatism, started out as a revolutionary one. So the revolution is 45 years old as we speak. So I wonder, from your view, was the revolution started out as a conservative revolution, or did it become more conservative over time?
I think the vision and inception of at the inception of the Islamic Republic was very religious in its nature. The founder, Khomeini, was very religious, had a very conservative vision for Iran, which was very different to what had been under the Pahlavi monarchy. Very different. He envisioned an Iran that was Islamic, which is why it's called the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's more cut off from the West. That is cut off from Israel. Before what your viewers may or may not know is that before the Islamic Republic emerged, for decades, Israel and Iran had actually had a lot of military, academic, intelligence cooperation that that would now seem unthinkable. So I would say that the trajectory of the Islamic Republic from its inception to now, I think, has been fairly consistent in that it's rigorously conservative and rigorously sort of trying to replicate an Islamic sort of, not caliphate, but an Islamic society in the image of the founder, Khomeini.
I'd like to move on, of course, to Israel. Of course, the ICC arrest warrant is something that everyone knows, and everyone who likes Israel hates it. I'm told that alongside Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, three Hamas leaders were also part of the indictment. So I wonder, why do Israelis see it as a direct attack on their leaders?
Look, I don't know what the reaction would have been had the ICC issued completely separate arrest warrants for Bibi Netanyahu, Gallant, and whoever they wanted to in the Israeli government, and then, or first, issued arrest warrants to Hamas leaders. But the fact that it was done, together is very bizarre and huge mistake. And it's a huge mistake for the prosecutor of the ICC to do this, because it makes no sense, and it's equating these two. One is Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization that infiltrated a music festival and communities on a Jewish holiday on October the 7th, and massacred 1,200 people and took 250 more hostage. That's what set off this horrible, horrible war, where we've seen innocent people on both sides die as a result of what happened on October the 7th. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the ICC is issuing arrest warrants to a democratic country that is, of course, it's not without its own challenges and its own problems, which is why we've seen hundreds of thousands of Israelis inside Israel protesting since October 7th and also before October 7th. And it was also why Netanyahu had his own or has his own corruption trial that's going on in Israel. So I'm not saying Israel hasn't got its own challenges, but the fact that you're drawing parallels between a democratic country that is looking to defend itself and a horrific terrorist organization that is its genocidal intent has been publicly stated on various occasions, that it's a terrible mistake, and it's an awful thing to do, and it makes no sense. And I think, if anything, doing this in a bizarre way, it sort of benefits Netanyahu, in that it's forcing any political opposition that Netanyahu has to rally around him, to rightly say that this is a ridiculous statement to make. And any of his political opponents who may have been opposed to anything he's been doing can't really say anything now, because of this outrageous warrant. And many Israelis, as a result of what I've been saying, see this not just as an attack on Israeli individual government leaders like Netanyahu or Gallant. They see it as an attack on Israel as a whole. When you're attacking, or when you're comparing Israel to Hamas in the same warrant.
Yes. But I do know that, Netanyahu is no war criminal or genocidaire or whatnot, but he is a deeply unpopular man, I think, both in Israel as well as in American Jewish communities, and perhaps international Jewish communities. Before October the 7th happened, there were protests going on for months, decrying him and his government. So I wonder why the sudden rally to, I suppose, Netanyahu's defense.
You're asking why now they would be rallying to his defense?
Yes.
Well, touches on what I said before, because I suspect that a lot of Israelis who may or may not agree with what Netanyahu is saying see these attacks by these organizations that don't have jurisdiction over Israel, that the fact that they're equating Hamas to Israel, they see it not just as an attack on an individual government member, but as an attack on the whole. That's why Israelis are, they're putting aside any personal issues they have with Netanyahu, and they're seeing this as an actual attack on them. And the fact that ICC is almost essentially describing Israel as a terrorist organization.
I understand. Okay. So I was I remember the morning of October the 7th very well. I was not in Israel, but I woke up to the news, and of course, being horrified by the attack. I'm also horrified by what's to come, which is what would be the overwhelming anti-Israel sentiments that would travel across the world, and in particular in social media. And because I lived through 2021, right, when Hamas did launch a flurry of rockets into Israeli soil, and there were like vicious anti-Israel sentiments then. But to this day, I'm still very surprised at the intensity of this like anti-Israel bias. And I wonder, having covered Israeli affairs for such a long time, did you share the same surprise as I do?
In many ways, what we saw happen on October 7th and the war that followed has been unprecedented in terms of its duration. We haven't seen a war go on for this long in terms of its scale. But it does follow certain consistent patterns, in that Hamas attacks Israel, Israel responds in a way to deter further attacks. And in order to do that, it has to, respond aggressively. And then there's sort of a short memory. Not you don't look back at what caused the initial attack to begin with, and there's just a focus on the current situation. So I think in the most simplistic form, that's been a fairly consistent pattern, that Israel has been attacked and hasn't been allowed to respond sufficiently in order to prevent further attacks. So in a way, that didn't surprise me, but I share your concerns that the sort of level of hostility, and in many cases, it's not just anti-Israel hostility, the sort of not blurring, evisceration of lines between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, of anti-Israel sentiment, have completely been gone. And there's sort of open season on that sort of horrible stuff that you see online and in the way people speak. They speak almost interchangeably between Jews and Zionists, and it's why we saw that on college campuses as well. And when you mix in ignorance and people who have just been studying up on the conflict using TikTok and headlines and what news notifications, it's quite toxic and very dangerous.
Yes. I think at some point I sort of stopped doing the hair splitting between is it anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because there's a flavor of anti-Semitism in anti-Zionism, whether the person who propagates these anti-Zionist views are actually anti-Semitic or not, because both strands of ideas traffic on falsehoods.
Yeah, and the sort of distinction, the way I see it is, for example, is people who are protesting in Israel, who've been protesting in Israel, whether it's before October the 7th or after October the 7th, they're not anti-Semitic, obviously, but they are against certain policies or priorities that the government has been pursuing. For example, for the families of hostages, they want the government to prioritize by any means necessary the return of the hostages over the further pursuit or expansion of this war. No, but obviously, I'm sure you agree with me that they're not being anti-Semitic in any way, but they're against certain policies or certain individuals in the Israeli government. But that sort of nuance you don't see elsewhere, and that's where it gets very slippery very quickly.
Um, so tell me about how the Iran-Israel relationship devolved, because I know that in the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq war, as you've mentioned, Israel was somewhat on the side of Iran. They were trading arms with each other, and of course that all blew over when they found out about the US's involvement, right? The Contra scandal and whatnot. And even during the Gulf War, when Iraq was launching Scud missiles into Israeli soil, Iraq was the prime enemy of the Israelis and not Iran. So what happened after that?
Um, well, I mentioned it before just because it's interesting to see how drastically things have devolved. But not too long ago, Iran was one of the first countries, I think the first one maybe after Turkey, to recognize the state of Israel in the UN. And since then, well, they had, as I mentioned before, they had almost a half a century of these bilateral relations under the Pahlavi dynasty. They established, and this was in part a strategy on Israel's side because it wanted to establish ties with non-Arab countries in its early days, early few decades, as it was fending off attacks by its neighbors. So there was very much a strategic partnership going on. But after the Islamic Republic of Iran, that cooperation very quickly dissipated after a couple of years, as you mentioned. And since then, the clerical establishment in Iran has very much viewed the US as the great Satan, and then the Israel as its sort of deputy, as its little Satan, and discouraging any sort of cooperation or ties whatsoever. And that's how and up until this point, in the past couple of decades, there's Israel and Iran have been engaged in a sort of shadow war where they're, whether or not they're attacking each other in the cyberspace or through assassinations. And we only saw this year, a couple months back, that Iran engaged with Israel directly for the first time. So hopefully things don't escalate further than that. But it's I think the relationship between Israel and Iran has never been so tense as it is now. And they're both almost, you can see them as one of the most powerful, two of the most powerful nations in the Middle East, alongside Saudi Arabia. And for both of them, Saudi Arabia has been seen as a sort of not prize, but like a sort of the crown jewel that they're both fighting for Israel's side. And what many say precipitated when this triggered the October 7th attacks was Israel and Saudi Arabia was so close to normalizing relations, and that would have posed a massive threat to Iran's hegemonic regional ambitions. Whereas, which was what may have prompted the October the 7th attacks, but for Iran, they want to establish new sort of ties with Saudi Arabia to achieve a sort of neutrality and a new order in the Middle East. So we'll see what goes from here.
Okay. So I'd like to transition to the policy of the country that you are a resident of, the United States, and in particular, the nuclear deal and its revival, so to speak, in the Biden administration. Now, I have two big questions regarding this. One is that is it the case that the deal, which was completed under the Obama administration, the JCPOA, is it its goal to provide the Iranians with a nuclear bomb, or is it just enables a nuclear program to exist in Iran under, say, IAEA prescriptions and guidelines?
Sorry, you cut off in the last 10 seconds
All
of
right,
your
so
question.
so it's the JCPOA. It's aimed to provide Iran with a nuclear bomb, or is it just a nuclear program, weaponized nuclear program under IAEA prescriptions and guidelines and parameters?
Well, if you ask officials in Iran, they'll say that the reason why they want this weapon is for peaceful reasons. They don't want it in order to be offensive rather than defensive, the same way that other countries in the world have it. But it's very hard, having seen the sort of destruction that the Islamic Republic has caused without a nuclear weapon. It's what you can imagine what it would do with a nuclear weapon, and Israel can't afford that, of course. And I think the main issue, one of the big issues with October the 7th, is that it's sort of been a distraction. And a couple of analysts have coined the term that October the 7th was almost a sort of weapon of mass distraction that was almost initiated or engineered by Iran, even though Tehran had helped with the training and funding of Hamas, and it has its fingerprints all over the October the 7th attacks. These attacks also allowed Iran to focus behind the scenes on turbocharging its nuclear programs, and we saw, this week, every week we see more reports about Iran amassing, enough uranium for more bombs, and that stockpile has reportedly grown in the months since Israel and Hamas have been fighting. So it's Israel, always talking about Israel fighting, fights on multiple fronts, whether it's with Hamas or Hezbollah on the Lebanon border. But those are just the sort of tentacles, and the octopus, the head of the octopus, is the Islamic Republic, and the October the 7th attacks were catastrophic, of course, but they also as damaging was the sort of distraction that it's caused. Israel's it's a tiny country, so it can only focus effectively on so many adversaries, and that's, I think, benefited Tehran a lot.
Right. I certainly believe that the intent of the Obama and Biden administration is to provide a sort of overture to the Iranian Republic. But I do know that there are a coterie of, I guess, American foreign policy realist scholars who advocate for a nuclear bomb to exist in Iran. I'm thinking of people like Kenneth Waltz and I suppose John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. They rely on a version of game theory, I suppose, in which they see that Israel has a nuclear weapon, and so far Israel is the only country in the Middle East that has a nuclear weapon. And if Iran, Israel's sworn enemy, has one, then the tip of the balance of power will be establish, and in some ways there would be little chance of any small-scale wars between the Iranians and the Israelis, such as the case in April of this year when Iran launched an attack against Israel, as well as its sponsorship of the terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and all that stuff. How much stock do you take in this rationale?
Uh, I don't subscribe to the idea that the more nuclear weapons you have scattered across the Middle East, the safer the Middle East is going to be. So I, I, I don't, I can see, I can understand that rationale, but I definitely don't agree with it, especially when you've seen what sort of chaos the Islamic Republic has caused without a nuclear weapon. I don't think it's going to be any safer or any more peaceful and a peaceful player in the region with one.
So how is an unstable Middle East benefit the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, before October the 7th, you saw a couple years before we saw Israel focusing on sort of Abraham Accords, forging ties with countries that would have been unthinkable to forge ties with a couple decades back. And that's a sort of peaceful approach to creating a more prosperous, economically vibrant Middle East. And in many cases, it could be seen as a worst case scenario for Iran as Israel gains more allies in the region. That can be seen as an affront to Iran because Israel is its sworn enemy. So the fact that Israel was progressing very closely to a full normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia, which is the like the ultimate prize, that was too much for the Islamic Republic to handle, and which is why many experts say that that's why the timing of the October 7th attacks was on the October the 7th, because of how close they were to a normalization. So having this sort of instability and Israel not being able to focus on these peaceful goals and rather having to engage in a war definitely benefits Iran, because it thrives in instability in large part because of the vast proxy network that it has established throughout the Middle East, where it can sort of create chaos and damage and instability without getting its hands particularly dirty. It's got all sorts of players in the region that do its work for it.
All right. So two final questions. So one in regards to the Abraham Accords. First, I think it's remarkable that even after the October 7 attacks and Israel's response, the Accords, the process of Abraham has not been hampered in any ways. Neither Bahrain or UAE has withdrawn their normalization processes, for example. But I do hear that detractors of the Abraham process say that, well, the process is well, grounded on one, to deter the Islamic Republic of Iran, of course, but secondly, to bypass the Palestinians altogether. So it's the opposite of, say, the Oslo Accords, where you start with the Palestinians and then you move on to other Arab countries. This time you just go around Arabia to normalize relations with the Arab nations without, I guess, considering the fate of the Palestinians. So I wonder, do you believe that that is a viable strategy in the long run?
I don't think you can forever ignore making peace with Palestinians. I think that I also think that it's important to pick the right time and place setting for it. Like, for example, I don't think the right time to talk about creating a Palestinian state is right, in the wake of the October the 7th attacks, because to many, it's not going to engender goodwill when you're talking about, almost, if in Israel's case, rewarding our country being attacked, and here you go, you get a state. But I think you can't ignore the fact that there needs to be, in order to have peace, long-standing peace, you need to have compromise, and you need to have but in order to, and you need to have sort of, you need to address the Palestinian issue. But in order to do that, you need to have players on both sides who want to create peace and don't want to create havoc. And Hamas is not a player that wants peace. It's not going to add, it doesn't support or recognize an Israeli state. And Israelis certainly don't want to live alongside a Palestine that is governed by a country that openly calls for its decimation and destruction. So I think that there, of course, my hope and dream is that there would be peace. Family there, of course, but the timing and the place and the players have to be right as well in order for it to be sustainable and ultimately peaceful.
Yes. Okay. So finally, President Biden, as far as I can tell, have been simultaneously called anti-Israel and pro-Israel. On one hand, he's seen as being too harsh on or being too reluctant to aid Israel, given his recent intervention to stop an aid package to Israel, as I've seen, and at the same time, I've heard that many Democratic voters are switching to Republican because they are displeased with Biden's Israel Middle East policy. So, but this year is an election year. So, how do you suppose Biden's actions in regards to Israel play into his chances of winning the presidency?
It is an interesting dynamic because, right from the beginning of the October the 7th attacks, we saw President Biden and his administration being very sympathetic and empathetic, and I think being one of the first, if not the first president to go to Israel while Israel was at war. And for decades, he's been a supporter of Israel and its right to defend itself. But it is interesting that we've seen both sides, elements of both sides saying that Biden is against them. It's a tricky thing for the administration to navigate, especially in an election year, and especially as elements of the Democratic Party are threatening to defect or to leave or to just not vote for either party, and threaten to sort of hamper his chances of being re-elected. But we saw President Biden's speech today, where he encouraged both the Israelis and the Palestinians to focus more on reaching a peaceful outcome. I think ultimately the best outcome from President Biden is one where a ceasefire is actually reached, but a ceasefire that is satisfying to both sides, in that it's not just a ceasefire that allows Hamas to regroup and rearm, but a ceasefire that sees the return of all the hostages still held in Gaza, and sees perhaps a re-examination of who should be in charge in Gaza, so that the Palestinians are prioritized, and so that whoever's leading the Palestinians doesn't prioritize the destruction of its neighbors over the security and prosperity of its own people. And that's something that definitely Hamas hasn't been doing. It knew, for example, from the outset that Israel was not going to respond in kind to being attacked like that in such an unprecedented and horrific fashion, and it chose to do so instead. So it's a lot of the suffering that we're seeing now, the horrible suffering that we're seeing now, is on Hamas's hands.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Jonathan Harounoff, for joining this program.
Thank you.